Imagine it's 30th of June 2011. You are a 22-year-old nursing student living in Santiago, Chile. You rent a narrow room above a bakery where the smell of warm bread slips under the door before sunrise. Your mother keeps a notebook in the kitchen with every peso the family owes, and your tuition bill sits on the top page like a stone. You take the metro to class, buy the cheapest lunch you can find, and tell yourself the loans are temporary, just a bridge to a better life. On weekends, you work extra shifts, not to get ahead but to stop the water from rising. You still believe the promise that education is the staircase out of struggle, and that if you climb hard enough, the future will open. If you have ever wondered why a debt taken on at age 18 can shape a whole country 10 or 20 years later, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Then one morning the city changes sound, helicopters, sirens, chants rolling down the avenue like weather. Tens of thousands of students flood the streets, banging drums, lifting signs, and shouting that they are being sold an education like a luxury handbag. President Sebastián Piñera offers a $4 billion education fund, but the anger does not fade. It grows. Because the problem is not one bill or one minister or one bad year. The problem is the machine itself. In Chile, students said the state had abandoned public higher education in favor of a market system built on high tuition, high debt, and private institutions. By 2011, 85% of Chilean students were enrolled in private institutions, and the gap in access was brutal. Gross higher education enrollment was about 27% for the bottom income decile and 91% for the top one. What looked like a ladder was starting to feel like a trap door. And that is what this video is really about, not just student debt as a personal burden, but student debt as an economic force, a force that can quietly drain spending, delay families, choke new businesses, distort politics, and push the cost of today's promises into tomorrow's tax bill. Collapse is rarely a bomb that goes off all at once. More often, it is a fuse burning inside the walls. Student debt works like that. It is not always loud at first. It is slow, administrative, boring even. A monthly deduction here, a deferred dream there. But history shows that when enough young adults begin their working lives already carrying a claim on their future wages, the damage does not stay personal for long. It spreads outward through housing, through consumption, through fertility, through risk-taking, through the basic confidence that makes an economy feel alive. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Student debt is not dangerous only because the numbers are large. It becomes dangerous because of where it sits. It sits at the front door of adult life. Mortgage debt usually comes after you already have a home. Business debt often comes after you already have an asset or a company. But student debt arrives before the furniture, before the savings, before the first serious pay raise, before the first child, before any real cushion exists. It is like putting a toll booth on the road before the road even reaches the city. That changes behavior in ways headline numbers often miss. When easy loans chase a product with limited supply, prices tend to rise. Colleges see more money coming in. Students see a bill that can be delayed. Governments see access expanding without writing the full cost directly into the budget. Everyone feels richer in the present, but the bill is not gone. It has just been mailed into the future. And because many schools get paid up front while borrowers carry the risk for decades, the system can reward volume more than value. That is the root mechanism. Not education itself, which can be life-changing, but a financing model that pushes more and more cost onto people whose future income has not happened yet. Think of it like building a bridge out of ice. In winter it looks solid. People walk across it. Politicians point to it. Lenders profit from it. Schools expand because of it. But the strength of the bridge depends on a future season nobody controls. If wages rise strongly, if degrees pay off broadly, if housing remains affordable, if recessions stay away, the structure holds. But if wages stall, if returns vary wildly by school and subject, if rent and healthcare keep rising, then the ice thins from below. The bridge still looks fine from a distance. Up close, you can hear it cracking. This brings us directly to Chile, because Chile shows what happens when higher education is treated like a market first and a public system second. The state-guaranteed student loan program known as CAE was launched in 2005. In theory, it widened access. In practice, it poured fuel on an already expensive system. Private institutions expanded, more students enrolled, more families borrowed, and because the debt was backed by the state, lenders had protection that ordinary borrowers did not. The country had built a machine that could produce graduates, debtors, and political anger at the same time. By 2011, the machine was overheating in public view. Student leaders like Camila Vallejo and Giorgio Jackson became nationally known because what they were saying matched what families were already feeling at the dinner table. Parents were not refusing education. They were refusing a future in which the ticket to social mobility arrived chained to decades of repayment. The protests were not only about idealism, they were about household math. They were about families looking at their sons and daughters and realizing that the reward for ambition might be years of financial drag. That drag matters economically because households do not live in spreadsheets. They live in apartments, bus rides, grocery bills, and postponed choices. If a young graduate spends the first working years sending a chunk of income backward to pay for the past, that money is not moving forward into the rest of the economy. It does not become a down payment. It does not furnish a first home. It does not seed a small business. It does not create a buffer against a layoff. Debt overhang is the term economists use. In plain English, it means the past is sitting on the chest of the future. Chile's own structure made that feeling sharper. Brookings notes that Chile's higher education system had become heavily privatized, with 85% of students in private institutions, many of them for profit. Students argued that education had been turned into a commodity, which means something bought and sold like any other product, with expensive tuition and high debt doing the sorting. That kind of system can look dynamic in boom years. Enrollment rises, campuses multiply, access widens on paper, but it also creates a strange illusion. The country seems to be investing in its future while quietly billing that future twice. Look at what happened next. In the 2013 presidential campaign, Michelle Bachelet made free college a central pledge. In 2016, Chile adopted gratuidad, a tuition-free policy for many lower and middle-income students at eligible institutions. That policy was not perfect, and it did not erase every debt already taken on, but it mattered because it was an admission. The previous model had gone too far. When a country moves from expanding loan finance to partially replacing it with free tuition, it is confessing something important. The loan system may have broadened access, but it also spread a cost structure that had become politically and socially unstable. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. Chile was not a poor country suddenly unable to educate its young. It was a country that found a way to educate more people while delaying the true cost. That is the seductive part of debt. It can make a hard choice disappear for a few years. Then it brings the choice back with interest, frustration, and distrust attached. A debt system is like a stage magician. It does not destroy the object. It only moves it where the audience cannot see it. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. When a generation is told that the only safe path is to borrow first and hope later, is that really education, or is it a wager placed on the labor market? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. The second part of this story unfolds not in Santiago, but in England. In 2010, Britain made a choice that seemed technocratic, which means dry and administrative, but it reached deep into the lives of ordinary graduates. The government announced that universities in England would be able to charge tuition fees of up to £9,000 a year from 2012, up from £3,290. Much of the cost of higher education was being shifted from the state to students. Supporters called it sustainable. Critics called it a tragedy for a generation. Both understood the same basic fact. The funding burden was being moved, not removed. Now here is where it gets interesting. England did not build the same kind of system as the United States. Its loans were income contingent, which means repayments rose with earnings rather than arriving as a flat monthly bill no matter what. Under Plan 2, graduates repaid 9% of income above a threshold, and any remaining balance was written off after 30 years. On paper, that sounded humane. If earnings stayed low, payments stayed low. If earnings rose, payments rose. It was less like a normal loan and more like an extra tax attached to a degree, but that tax-like structure created its own strange reality. The debt numbers became enormous, even when the monthly pain was partly hidden. The House of Commons Library reports that the value of outstanding student loans in England reached £267 billion by the end of March 2025. The government forecasts the total could reach around £500 billion by the late 2040s. Borrowers who finished their course in 2024 had an average debt of £53,000 when they first became liable to repay in April 2025. And Plan 2 interest rates reached as high as 7.3%. That matters because balance size changes how people think, even when repayment is income-based. A mountain still looks like a mountain, even if the path up it is graded gently. Many graduates in England learn to live with student debt not as a temporary obstacle, but as background climate. Something always there, something attached to each raise, something that made the line between education funding and lifelong earnings extraction feel blurry. The Institute for Fiscal Studies described the repayment burden in simple terms. A borrower earning £35,000 could expect to repay about £49 a month. At £50,000, about £161. At £70,000, about £311. That is not always catastrophic, but over years and decades, it changes the texture of adulthood. It is the difference between building savings and treading water, between feeling a pay raise and watching part of it vanish, between freedom and a softer kind of leash. And because the system is so large, the burden is not only personal, it also lands on the public balance sheet. The same state that shifted more of the bill onto students remained deeply entangled in the risk. Official forecasts have long shown that large shares of these balances will never be repaid in full. For the 2022-23 full-time undergraduate cohort, the government forecast that only about 32% would repay in full, although reforms for later cohorts pushed that expected share higher. So what looked like personal responsibility was also public accounting. The debt was wearing two masks at once. This is the deeper lesson from England. A student debt system can function like a mirror maze. Borrowers see one reflection, the state sees another, universities see a third, and the true cost hides between them. Students do not pay up front, so access appears protected. Universities receive large fee income, so funding appears solved. Governments avoid full immediate spending, so budgets appear cleaner, but the obligation still exists. It simply sits in the system for decades, waiting to be repaid, written off, reformed, or quietly absorbed. The bomb is not always default. Sometimes it is a generation treating debt as weather, and the state quietly inheriting the cloud. This leads to the third part of the story, and this time we arrive in the United States, where the numbers are even larger and the structure is harsher. Nearly 43 million Americans now hold federal student loan debt, about 1 in 6 adults. The federal student loan portfolio has grown from $516 billion for 28.3 million students in 2007 to more than $1.6 trillion for 42.7 million students by fiscal year 2024. In the first quarter of 2025 alone, New York Fed data showed outstanding student debt at $1.63 trillion. In America, the promise was familiar: borrow now, increase your skills, earn more later. The problem is that the economy does not hand out later on schedule. Wages vary, degrees vary, institutions vary wildly. The labor market punishes some mistakes for years. And unlike a house, a degree cannot be sold to pay down the balance. It is an asset inside the borrower, but the loan sits outside the borrower like a collector at the gate. For a few years, the pandemic pause covered the cracks. Missed federal student loan payments were not being fully reported in the usual way. The numbers looked calmer than the reality. Then reporting resumed. In Q1 2025, 7.74% of aggregate student debt was reported 90 or more days delinquent, up from less than 1% in Q4 2024. The New York Fed found that more than 2.2 million newly delinquent borrowers saw their credit scores fall by more than 100 points, and more than 1 million saw drops of at least 150 points. Among age groups over 40, at least 1 in 4 borrowers was more than 90 days past due. That single fact should stop people cold. This is not only a story about recent graduates, it is also a story about middle age, parents, workers in their 40s and 50s, people who have been carrying an educational obligation for so long that it is fused with the structure of life itself. Student debt was sold as a short bridge. For many, it became a second shadow. The broader economic effects are easier to miss because they arrive as absences. The home not bought, the business not started, the baby postponed, the move not made, the risk not taken. Federal Reserve research found that a 10% increase in student loan debt causes a 1 to 2 percentage point drop in the home ownership rate for borrowers during the first 5 years after leaving school. Another Federal Reserve publication estimated that the rise in student debt between 2005 and 2014 reduced home ownership among young adults by 2 percentage points, accounting for a little over 20% of the overall decline for that age group. That is more than 400,000 young people missing from the homeowner column. The Philadelphia Fed found something equally striking. Between 2000 and 2010, a 1 standard deviation increase in student debt reduced the number of the very smallest businesses, firms with 1 to 4 employees, by 14% on average. That is not a side issue. Small firms are often where economic dynamism begins. They are the corner stores, repair shops, design studios, landscaping companies, and 2-person contractors that make a town feel like it still has oxygen. If student debt reduces the ability of young adults to use personal credit capacity to start those firms, then the cost of the loan system spreads far beyond campus. Now look at all three together. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for. The part they never put in textbooks. The same mechanism. Different countries, different decades. Same result. In Chile, debt widened access but helped turn education into a market product until the streets forced a political reckoning. In England, debt replaced more public funding while pretending to soften the blow through income-based repayment, leaving graduates with giant balances and the state with giant long-term exposure. In the United States, debt scaled into the trillions, pressed against home ownership and business formation, then reappeared on credit reports like a tide pulling back to reveal what had been there all along. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore once you stop looking only at default rates. Student debt does not need to create a banking panic to damage an economy. It can work more quietly than that. It can lower the temperature of a whole generation. Less spending, less mobility, less household formation, less appetite for risk. It is economic frost. Nothing dramatic happens on one single day. But over time, the harvest gets smaller. This is why comparisons to other debt crises matter, even when the asset is different. In the United States, before 2008, cheap mortgage credit helped push housing prices higher and made families feel wealthier until the structure broke. In Japan, after the bubble burst around 1990, debt overhang hung over the economy for years. Richard Koo later described that kind of slump as a balance sheet recession, meaning households or firms focus on repairing past debt instead of borrowing and spending, even when interest rates fall. In plain English, when too many people spend their energy fixing yesterday, tomorrow arrives weaker. Student debt is not identical to mortgages or speculative land bubbles, but it rhymes with them in one crucial way. It pulls future cash flow into past commitments. That is the heart of the mechanism. Once enough people are doing that at the same time, the economy does not explode like a movie scene. It sags like a roof taking on water. And because higher education is wrapped in moral language, it can be harder to question. People hesitate to criticize the financing system because they do not want to sound anti-education. That hesitation gives the system cover. There is also a counterintuitive fact here that most people miss. A country can expand college access and still weaken the economic payoff of that expansion if it finances the access badly. More degrees do not automatically mean more broad prosperity. If the price of entry keeps rising and the debt burden falls unevenly, the system can manufacture credentials while thinning out the middle-class future those credentials were supposed to secure. The orchard looks bigger. The fruit gets smaller. And this is where the human cost comes into focus. Debt never lands evenly. It lands where cushions are thin. The Federal Reserve reported that in 2024, 20% of student loan borrowers said they were behind on payments or in collections, up from 16% the year before. Borrowers earning less than $25,000 were especially likely to be behind. So were borrowers with only some college, a technical degree, or an associate degree. Hispanic and black borrowers reported higher rates of payment trouble. Borrowers who attended for-profit institutions were in the worst shape of all. 35% were behind. That last group matters because it reveals one of the ugliest features of debt booms. The people with the least margin for error are often sold the most expensive mistakes. In the United States, the collapse of Corinthian colleges in 2015 became a symbol of that dynamic. Corinthian had run for-profit schools under names like Everest, Heald, and Wyotech. Years later, in 2022, the U.S. government announced it would forgive $5.8 billion in federal loans for more than 560,000 borrowers who had attended Corinthian from 1995 until the chain collapsed. Think about what that means. The system did not simply produce debt. It helped produce debt tied to institutions that the government later concluded had harmed students on a mass scale. That is not a market correcting itself cleanly. That is wreckage being sorted after impact. Who walks away fine in these periods? Usually not the borrower with no savings and a shaky job. Usually not the family that believed every official promise. Usually not the small-town graduate paying rent, car insurance, childcare, and loan bills from the same modest paycheck. The people who tend to remain stable are those with high incomes, family wealth, lower debt burdens relative to earnings, or degrees from institutions with strong labor market returns. In other words, the system claims to open doors, but it often swings widest for people who already had a hallway behind them. History shows the broader spillovers, too. When young adults do not form households, other sectors lose customers. Fewer first homes means less spending on appliances, furniture, paint, moving services, repairs, and all the quiet industries that stand behind a front door. When potential founders cannot access credit because their debt-to-income ratios or credit scores are weak, towns lose the smallest new firms first. When debt stress persists into middle age, families save more defensively and spend less confidently. An economy is not one market. It is a chain of linked rooms. Student debt starts in one room and chills the whole house. Think again of Japan in the 1990s. After the asset bubble burst, consumers turned cautious, firms pulled back, and the economy drifted into its long gray slowdown. Student debt is not the same event. But it rhymes in feeling. A society burdened by old obligations becomes careful in a way that looks rational person by person and damaging in aggregate, which means in the whole economy taken together. Each household says, I must repair my balance sheet. The nation wakes up to weak demand. You can see the same pressure in ordinary family life. In the United States, many borrowers do not just carry debt themselves. They carry it inside households that are already trying to support children, aging parents, rent increases, and medical bills. In England, the system spreads the burden differently, but the psychological effect can be similar. Graduates step into work knowing a slice of each future raise is already spoken for. In Chile, before the reforms, parents and students marched together because the debt had ceased to feel like a private contract and started to feel like a family tax. When a whole generation leans on parents for housing, emergency cash, and delayed independence, the loan system turns the family itself into a shock absorber. The state writes the promise, the household eats the volatility, regional economies feel it too. A young graduate in a big city may at least have access to higher wages, roommates, mass transit, and more job options. A young graduate in a smaller town may face a crueler equation: lower pay, fewer openings, and the same debt. That can speed up what the Federal Reserve has called rural brain drain, which means educated young adults leaving smaller communities for larger labor markets. The effect is like pulling beams out of a wooden house one by one. The brightest workers leave for places where repayment is possible. The hometown loses future business owners, future home buyers, future civic leaders, and sometimes even future children in its schools. And there is one more hidden group that pays: taxpayers and middle-class savers. In England, enormous student loan balances sit on the state's books for decades. In Chile, the move toward free tuition after 2011 was also an acknowledgement that the old debt-heavy model had created obligations the public could no longer ignore. In the United States, every large forgiveness program, every servicing failure, every default wave, and every repayment freeze reopens the same argument: who finally absorbs the loss? In bad systems, the answer is everyone, just at different times. Borrowers pay first in stress. Families pay second in support. Taxpayers pay later through write-downs, subsidies, or political repair. The cost moves through society like smoke through connected rooms. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. So what did the survivors do differently in periods like this? Not the lucky few who struck it rich, the durable survivors. The historical record shows that those who came through debt-heavy eras with the least damage largely shared three characteristics, even when they lived in different countries and under different systems. First, they kept fixed obligations lower than the culture around them expected. In plain English, they left themselves room to breathe. In debt-heavy economies, flexibility is oxygen. A household with fewer mandatory payments can survive a job loss, a rate change, a delayed paycheck, or a bad year without spiraling. In the aftermath of the 2008 housing crisis, the households that could buy, move, or wait were usually the ones not already pinned under maximum leverage, which means maximum borrowing. Second, they treated credentials and prices as separate questions. This sounds obvious, but history shows it is rare. In bubbles, people confuse access with value. They assume that because something is praised socially, any price attached to it must also make sense. The survivors were more skeptical. They asked whether the earning power matched the debt. They asked whether the institution had real outcomes or only glossy marketing. They understood that prestige can behave like perfume, strong enough to hide decay for a while. Third, they moved toward systems that tied repayment to actual earning power rather than fantasy earnings. This is one reason Australia is such a useful contrast. Australia introduced income-contingent higher education repayment in 1989 through HESES, later HELP. Loans were indexed to inflation, not loaded with normal interest, and repayment began only above an income threshold through the tax system. That did not make higher education free, and it did not solve every problem, but it reduced the chance that a low-earning graduate would be crushed by a fixed monthly bill. It recognized something basic. The value of education is uncertain at the individual level, so the repayment system should bend when life bends. That does not mean every Australian borrower felt happy. It means the structure absorbed shocks differently. History often rewards not the society with the most credit, but the society with the least brittle credit. Brittle means hard but easy to snap. Flexible systems bend. Brittle systems shatter. The same is true for households. Which brings us back to that room above the bakery in Santiago, to the notebook on the kitchen table, to the belief that education would open a door, and the fear that the key itself had been financed on terms the family could barely carry. For people like that young nursing student, the protests of 2011 were not abstract politics. They were a scream from the pressure chamber. When Chile later moved toward free tuition for many students in 2016, it was not because the country had suddenly become sentimental. It was because the old settlement had become too visibly unstable. The lesson is not that education is a mistake. The lesson is that a society can poison a good thing by financing it badly. History shows that when the cost of entry into adult life is pushed onto fragile future income, the damage radiates outward, first into homes, then into births, then into businesses, then into politics, then into the public balance sheet itself. What begins as a private promise can end as a national drag. And the most dangerous part is how normal it can feel while it is building. No bank run, no smoke, no dramatic countdown clock. Just millions of people adjusting quietly month after month to a smaller life than the one they were promised. That is how debt changes an economy. Not always with a bang, sometimes with a narrowing. Like a river forced through a pipe. The same human ambition keeps flowing, but the channel gets tighter and the pressure rises. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.